Can you hear me? Can you see me? Wow, I got some answers to that. That second question was kind of bizarre, wasn't it? But imagine yourself in this situation, maybe at work. You're in the middle of the conversation with somebody, and you begin to get a really strange feeling that somehow they're not really there. So you ask, can you hear me? No response. And if you look closely at them, you can see they're not angry or disinterested or being rude. You get even more concerned. And this time you ask, can you see me? Still no answer. Now at this point, you might begin to panic, and you might be tempted to yell and flail your arms. Can you hear me? Can you see? Big mistake. Because the louder you get, and the more insistent you are, the less likely that you'll get a response. I've had this experience more than once in my line of work. I'm a psychologist. As a psychologist, I do a number of things, but one of them is doing psychotherapy. And I specialize in working with people who've been through inexpressible, unimaginable catastrophes. People who've suffered severe physical injury, sexual violence, and close encounters with violent death. I'm a trauma psychologist. Some of the people I work with started out life in relatively fortunate circumstances. They grew up with love and guidance, went to school, got good grades, made friends, and as adults, had very little trouble finding a good job, establishing financial security, were able to sustain a circle of social support, maybe even fell in love and started a family. For them, time was predictable, structured, maybe even at times routine and boring. Until suddenly, because that's the way trauma usually arrives, maybe in a terrible car crash, maybe in a violent criminal assault. For them, time's nature suddenly changed. Everything inside them sped up. Their heart rate spiked. Their thoughts raced in a jumble, and everything around them seemed to slow down. Because that traumatic event triggered a reflex that all of us are born with that's designed to increase the likelihood that we survive a catastrophic event. The fight, flight, freeze reflex that immediately prepares the body and the mind to either fight against an attacker, flee from danger, or, if those two alternatives aren't possible, to freeze, shut down until the traumatic event is over. And for these folks, when the traumatic event was over, gradually they found that they returned to their normal, predictable, conventional sense of time until maybe later that day, a week later, perhaps months, years, or even decades later, something reminded them of that traumatic event, and just as suddenly the flight, freeze reflex was triggered, and they found themselves back there, yanked back into the past, yanked back to that traumatic moment. So what they saw was what they saw at the moment of the trauma. What they heard was what they heard at the moment of trauma. What they felt was what they felt at that moment. A traumatic flashback that sometimes is so intense that the person does not see or hear what's right in front of them. They're not present. They're back in the past. And once a trauma flashback is triggered, maybe decades later, it's highly likely that those flashbacks will return again and again and again. That's often one of the major things that brings people into therapy. Some of the people that I work with started life in considerably less fortunate circumstances. They did not grow up with love and guidance. They were neglected or verbally abused or sexually abused or physically abused, or for many of the people that I see, all of these were characteristics of their growing up years. Like the first group, even as children, however, they often were yanked back into past experiences of traumatic abuse by flashbacks. But in addition, they often during their growing up years found themselves suddenly in a blank, silent, timeless void with little or no ability to know what they were saying, be aware of what they were doing, or know what was going on around them. Some of these people arrive at adulthood with little to no memory of their growing up years because they spend their entire childhood and adolescence in a traumatic haze. For them, things are usually much more difficult. They're less likely to get good grades in school. They're less likely to make friends. And if they have the ability to summon the focus, to be able to think ahead into the future, they yearn for the day when they can escape their abusive household and strike out on their own. But when they reach that moment, they find that the trauma flashbacks don't end, that slipping into the blank, timeless void doesn't end. For them, it's much more difficult to become employed, to hold down a job, to become financially stable. They almost never have a supportive circle of friends, much less fall in love, be able to sustain that relationship, and start a household. It's under these conditions that the second group, survivors of prolonged child abuse, enter into therapy, desperately hoping that the therapist can help them end their misery, especially because they feel that they are standing still, or worse yet, that they are moving backwards, because it seems like they see everybody around them moving forward in life. And they just seem to be slipping further and further behind. But they've had so many experiences of being betrayed and so many experiences of being hurt that as much as they want the therapist to help them, it's incredibly hard to trust. And even more importantly, difficult to break through that traumatic haze and really hear and really see the person that they're relying on to help them. Psychological science has developed a whole range of therapeutic strategies to help trauma survivors, to help survivors of prolonged child abuse. But as someone who's been doing this work for many years, my conviction, supported by science, is that the most important element in helping somebody overcome trauma is the bond that develops between therapist and survivor. A strong, resilient bond. But how do you develop a bond with someone who's lost in a blank void? How do you develop a bond with someone who can't clearly see you, can't clearly hear you? The trauma therapist's challenge is to stay focused, even when the survivor is lost in the blank void, even when the survivor is in the midst of a traumatic flashback, for the therapist to be present. That presence provides a signal that gradually over time, not days, not weeks, at least months, sometimes years, the survivor can gradually follow into the present. And there comes a moment in therapy when for the first time, the survivor, whose body has been in the therapy room now for months or years, is there and connected to the therapist. It's a solid bond that both of them can feel. That connection becomes the foundation for the rest of therapy. Through that foundation, through for the first time, really being able to hear clearly, really being able to see clearly, the survivor is able to recognize, by being present in the present, what is true and what is not. The indoctrination that the survivor of prolonged child abuse experienced growing up. You're stupid. You're ugly. You're inept. You're unlovable. Begins to erode under the light of being able to see things for what they really are. And it becomes clear to the survivor at this point that they can have the life that they always dreamed about as they develop a sense of self that's more solid and more competent and more confident. But almost always at this juncture, the survivor looks over their shoulder and realizes all the years, sometimes decades, because now they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s, sometimes 60s and beyond. And they look over their shoulder and they see all the years that have been lost when they could have been living this life if they hadn't been brainwashed into believing that they're other than they are, if they had grown up with people who taught them all the complexities that are required for successful adult living. And so at this juncture, the survivor has to stop in time and mourn all those lost years before they can move ahead. I'm happy to tell you, I have never seen someone reach this juncture, because often what people say to themselves is, it's too late. It's too late. But once they get through that mourning period, everybody that I've worked with has decided to move on. It's really miraculous to see somebody for the first time hold down a job, for the first time become financially stable, and to be amazed to look around them and see that they have a network of social support. But that's not the most amazing part of healing from prolonged child abuse. The best way for me to convey to you the most amazing part of healing from prolonged child abuse is the words of survivors themselves. One of them said to me, "I didn't know life could be like this. And if you had told me at the beginning of therapy, it's not that I wouldn't have believed you. It would have been as if you were speaking a foreign language. I would have had no idea what you were talking about." Another survivor who, on their way to healing several times, fell so deeply into despair that she seriously considered suicide, simply said, "This amazing life. And to think, I almost missed it." Healing from trauma, healing from prolonged child abuse, in fact, any kind of emotional and psychological growth occurs through interpersonal connection. When we're connected with other people, we're able to more clearly hear and see and feel what's going on around us and be connected to our surroundings, and even better able to notice what's going on within us and be connected to our own experience. When people find out I'm a therapist, sometimes they say, "Oh my goodness, how do you spend your days listening to people's problems?" That's not the way I think of what I do. I have the privilege to watch people heal, to participate in that process. I've had the privilege to really learn what it means to truly hear, to truly see, to truly be present in the present. If we choose a life guided by connection to each other, then all of us can discover what it means to say, "I never knew life could be like this." And to think, "I almost missed it."